Hey everybody, I'm Ken Argenbright, and I'm going to be talking to you about hydrogen vehicles and if they're going to be the future of the car industry. Next slide. General overview, I'm going to go briefly on how hydrogen cars work, and then I'm going to talk to you about why they are going to be valuable to customers in the future. Next slide. For the most part, hydrogen cars rely on fuel cells to produce electricity from hydrogen through a process called electrolysis, and then it uses that electricity that is produced to power the electric motor. Next slide. Electrolysis is basically when you apply electricity to water and it breaks down the molecules into separate hydrogen and oxygen atoms, which this can be useful if you take that process and reverse it. Next slide. By doing that, you'll just take some hydrogen and some oxygen and combine it, and it'll produce three things: water, heat, and electricity. So basically it comes off as steam when you combine the water and heat, but you still have the hydrogen going in and electricity coming out. Next slide. So why are hydrogen fueled cars going to be the big future? Why should we even care? Next slide. The biggest reason is definitely to cut down on pollution and then not to use up as many fossil fuels because those are pretty limited and we're going to run out eventually. Next slide. But the big question is it practical? And how do you measure its usefulness? And for that, I'm going to go to the buyer's utility map. Next slide. Now we get this from our textbook, obviously. And I'm going to go through step by step through each stage: purchase, delivery, use, supplements, and maintenance. I'm going to skip disposal because it's not really that different from gasoline vehicles. And then apply whichever levers that are different from gasoline vehicles compared to the hydrogen vehicles. Next slide. So first is purchase. As far as customer productivity, it's not doing so hot. At least not yet. Some of the parts within the fuel cell are made of platinum, so that drives the price way up to about $100,000 a vehicle. So not many people are willing to pay that much. It also kind of makes it only for lease so far. Currently, though, research and development are trying to work on different enabling technologies, basically something else besides platinum that'll make the fuel cells work and not be so expensive. Next slide. As far as delivery, not so good yet either, just because you can only get these cars in California. Unfortunately, the infrastructure has not expanded quite yet, but over the next couple of years, it should be expanding almost exponentially, hopefully, and then it'll be less of a problem. Next slide. As far as use, environmental friendliness is super better, if that's grammatically correct. You have absolutely no pollution, and the only byproducts is water and heat, i.e. steam. Not so bad. Next slide. As far as risks, well, they are high pressure tanks in your vehicle and hydrogen is also flammable, but so is gasoline. And in fact, compared to gasoline, hydrogen doesn't burn at nearly as high of a temperature as gasoline. And it also rises quickly because of how light the molecules are, so that it gets out of reach of the flames in the first place. So this drastically reduces the chance of a secondary fire. So not so bad. Next slide. There's a couple downsides to customer productivity. One is the tanks are a little bit bigger than gasoline tanks, but they're working on that to make that less inconvenient. And then as your car is sitting outside and warming up, the temperature rises and that makes gas expand. In order to relieve the pressure, the tanks have to vent off some of their hydrogen, which unfortunately wastes a little bit of it. But they're also working on things to fix that. So next slide. Now as far as the plus side, tanks are getting smaller, like I said. You can tell by this picture compared to the last one. The other one's a bit exaggerated, but they're really not that inconvenient and taking up too much space. As far as filling it up, it takes the same amount of time. You can go just as far, and it's got just as much power behind it as gasoline vehicles too. Next slide. Now, as far as resource uses, it's pretty much the most abundant element in the entire universe. Yeah. That's not even an exaggeration. Hydrogen is just made up of one proton and one electron, so naturally it's the most abundant. As far as prices go, it's not going to inflate like gasoline is. The more you use gas, the higher it's going to be because it's eventually going to run out. But hydrogen is infinitely renewable, and so as the infrastructure grows, it's actually predicted for the prices to drop for fueling up with hydrogen. Next slide. Now there's two ways to get hydrogen. One is to use natural gas, which unfortunately that's completely taken out the not depleting fossil fuels effect because it requires hydrocarbon, which is a fossil fuel, to produce hydrogen through steam reformation. So basically we'd be burning up natural resources anyways, kind of like our friend Mr. Moo Moo down there. Hashtag TurboCow. Anyways, next slide. As far as environmentally friendliness with its other process, you can still use that electrolysis that we talked about at the beginning by just applying that electricity to water to make hydrogen. Unfortunately, this is a slower process, not quite as effective, but it is useful. And depending on where you get your electricity from, it could be good or bad. If you get it from a coal factory, you're obviously taking away all of your environmental friendliness benefits. But if you get it from a solar plant or a wind-powered electrical plant, then you're doing pretty good. So that all depends. Next slide. As far as convenience, still not so good just because of that infrastructure thing. There's no fuel stations outside of California, but they're trying to expand that very rapidly, almost exponentially over the next couple of years. And that should be a pretty easy transition to do because all you're going to do is convert the fuel stations for gasoline and add hydrogen to those. So infrastructure's there, it just needs to be changed. It just takes a little bit of time and money to do so. And you can also have your own personal fueling station, which would be really nice. Just fuel up in your own garage. So, not sure what the price range is for that though. We'll see. Next slide. And last but not least, you have the maintenance. And for this, it's actually a little bit better because there's less movable parts within the system. And as a general rule of thumb, that means less maintenance to be done. Next slide. So as a review, the biggest advantages is it's got infinitely renewable energy source, has no pollution, and has all the same performance as gasoline pretty much. Biggest disadvantage is no infrastructure yet, and it's a little bit expensive. But over time, that'll get a lot better. Next slide. So as an overall conclusion, it's not the best option right now, but as this industry progresses, it'll build up some momentum, and then eventually it's going to take off. And it's going to be awesome. Next slide. And we're going to end with the quote from Toyota with its new commercial for its hydrogen vehicle that it's just coming out with. We're entering a new era of automotive history. The question isn't if you'll turn, it's when.